Well, thanks everybody for being here, and thank you to the Department of Philosophy for co-sponsoring this event. This is both a Department of Philosophy colloquium event, as well as a meeting of the Be Better Club through the UCF Center for Ethics. So we're really grateful you're here, and also cognizant of the time that we all spend on Zoom lately, but I promise this will be fun. So I want to welcome Dr. Satta, a friend and colleague of mine. Dr. Satta did his PhD at Purdue University, finishing that in 2016, if I've got that right.
Yep.
And then a JD at Harvard Law School, finishing in 2019, and has practiced law as an associate before transitioning back to philosophy full-time. So he's now an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy at Wayne State, and also an attorney and a member of the New York State Bar Association. Mark's work is wide-ranging, covering issues in epistemology, philosophy of language, bioethics, which is how I met him and sort of connected with him first, and First Amendment law. He's a prolific publisher already, including in several law review journals and top-tier philosophy journals. But maybe more importantly to this group, he's doing a lot of public-facing writing in a range of high-profile blogs and news outlets. So he's writing to a wider audience, which is something I know we all appreciate, both in ethics and in philosophy more generally. This event came about because Dr. Pugler, who's here with us and co-directs the Center for Ethics with me, had been asking really great questions in earlier sessions of the Be Better Club about the relationship between knowledge, value, and science. And so we want to bring you all an expert on that topic. So Dr. Satta will talk with us about his work on epistemic trespassing specifically, and then field our questions more generally. We'll be together today until about 4:30, and we'll share a recorded version of this talk with Dr. Satta's approval, of course, for your review later on, as well as on our Center for Ethics YouTube channel. So I hope you'll all join me in thanking Dr. Satta for being here and welcoming him. And Mark, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you all very much for having me. I first met Dr. Beaver at the start of my grad school career and towards the end of his. And I quickly decided I wanted to be the sort of philosopher he was someday. So I'm still working on that. So this talk, because we have a interdisciplinary audience, it's sort of going to happen in two stages. First, I'm just going to say some things about epistemology and the relationship between epistemology and ethics. And once I've sort of situated some of that general context, then I'm going to move into a specific application, talking about the issue of epistemic trespassing. And if you don't know what that is, that's okay. We'll talk about it by expert witnesses in courts of law. So that's sort of the most general agenda for what I'm aiming to do here. Thumbs up if you can see the screen. Great. Okay. So just to start, what is epistemology? So epistemology is the branch of philosophy. It deals with things like knowledge, rational belief, evidence, and related topics. As an epistemologist, some of the questions that me and my colleagues address in this field are things like, what do we know? And what does it mean to know something? When do we have enough evidence to treat a belief as settled? Or when should we act on a belief? That's sort of the territory of what epistemology is interested in. Within epistemology, there's a subfield commonly labeled as social epistemology. So that's the branch of epistemology that evaluates the social dimensions of knowledge, belief formation, and information sharing. So for example, when can we gain knowledge via testimony? Why should we trust experts? How does social identity impact what we know? And what responsibilities do we have to others when it comes to sharing information? And as you're hearing these questions or reading these questions, you might be thinking, that seems timely. I hope so, because I think between the COVID-19 pandemic and kind of the continuing political polarization in the United States, it's made some of the core questions in social epistemology particularly relevant, particularly salient to public dialogue. So, but I'm here speaking to the Center for Ethics in the philosophy department. So what does epistemology have to do with ethics? My own view, and the view I'd say of most epistemologists, is that the two areas of philosophy are tightly interwoven. There's lots of ethical considerations in epistemology. So just to motivate that general idea, here's a rather famous example from the history of philosophy. The 19th century philosopher, W.K. Clifford, he argued that we had ethical obligations to believe in accordance with our evidence. So it's not only that it's epistemically good that we believe in accordance with evidence, but that we have ethical obligations to do so. So he starts making his case by giving an example. Here's the example. So you've got someone who owns a passenger ship that people purchase tickets to go from Europe to America. This ship is old. You might think it's time for an inspection, but that inspection is going to cost a lot of money. It's going to be a hassle. He's not going to be able to send the ship out for a while. The ship owner really doesn't want to have the ship inspected. So he has this sort of like nagging doubt at first that maybe he ought to, but he sort of convinces himself it's not a problem. Don't worry about it. And I think this is sort of like a familiar sort of psychological position to think about being in, where you can sort of convince yourself to worry or not worry about something. He sort of convinces himself not to worry about it. And as a result, forms the belief, he's so successful, he forms the belief that my ship is totally fine. It's safe. He sells some tickets, passengers get on, the ship sinks midway across the Atlantic. He collects the insurance money and no one is the wiser. So Clifford gives this story because he wants us to have the reaction that that is morally abhorrent. What that ship owner has done is morally wrong. And that wrong is rooted in the epistemic. It was, so for Clifford, part of the moral wrong is that the ship owner believed the vessel was safe, contrary to the evidence. Now, epistemologists can disagree about what exactly the wrong is. Some people might say the real locus of the wrong, the real focus, is that he convinced himself that the ship was safe. You might think the bad thing that he did was convincing himself that the ship was safe and that the belief itself wasn't the bad thing. Or you might think both what he did to convince himself and the belief itself are morally problematic. For our purposes, we don't actually have to answer that question one way or another, although it's something I'd be happy to talk about during Q&A. The general idea, however, is that there is some sort of wrong here, some sort of moral wrong that's rooted in the ship owner's epistemic behavior or epistemic practices. So Clifford was focusing specifically on the bad of the moral belief, but you might think that you can have a social epistemic ethics more broadly, where we talk about both beliefs and actions potentially being right or wrong morally because of their epistemic character. So the idea that something can be two types of bad at once isn't particularly novel. So for example, you can have both moral and legal reasons to do something or not do something. You shouldn't rob your neighbor, both because it's immoral and because it's illegal. These are like both bad making properties of the behavior. Similarly, I would argue, and a lot of epistemologists would agree, that there can be both moral and epistemic reasons to do or not do something. So for example, you shouldn't intentionally share misinformation about COVID-19, both because it's morally bad and it's epistemically bad. Now, at this point, you might be wondering, well, what do you mean by epistemically bad? Or what would you mean by epistemically good? Epistemologists can disagree about what this means, but I think for our purposes, the general idea is something is epistemically good if it helps you find the truth or helps you get at the truth, and it's epistemically bad if it doesn't. And the you could be either you or somebody else. So it can be epistemically bad if I'm struggling to figure out the truth. But it can also be epistemically bad if I put you in a position where it's hard for you to figure out the truth. With that sort of broader conception of a social epistemic ethics, epistemology is for everybody, I'd say. This quote here I have is pulled from an essay that the epistemologist Michael Lynch wrote in the Boston Review just a couple weeks ago. And I thought it was so timely that it was worth reading. He writes, when millions of voters believe, despite all evidence, that the election was stolen, that vaccines are dangerous, and that a cabal of child predators rule the world from a pizza parlor's basement, it becomes clear that we cannot afford to ignore how knowledge is formed and distorted. In a real sense, we must all become epistemologists now, specifically of the kind that grapples with the challenges of the political world, a political epistemology. So I'm biased as an epistemologist, but I think he's right about this. And there's all sorts of interesting and thorny issues going on in what Lynch is calling political epistemology. I'm only able to talk about like a very small slice of social epistemology in this talk, but during the Q&A, I'm kind of happy to roam wherever you all might want within the broader territory of social and political epistemology. So, but at the start, I said I wanted to talk about epistemic trespassing, and then I'd say what that is. We reached that point in the talk. So epistemic trespassers are thinkers who have competence and or expertise to make good judgments in one field, but move to another field where they lack competence and pass judgment nevertheless. So this term, epistemic trespassing, only came into the philosophical lexicon quite recently. There were two papers published, one by Nathan Valentine called Epistemic Trespassing, and another one by a philosopher, Mikhail Gherkin, where he talks about epistemic trespassing testimony. So here are a couple of examples that Valentine gives of epistemic trespassers. The first one he gives is of the chemist and two-time Nobel Prize winner, Linus Pauling. So Pauling, 20th century chemist, does great work in chemistry. He also won a second Nobel Peace Prize, a second Nobel Prize, the Nobel Peace Prize. So he won one in chemistry and in peace. Super influential guy, prolific author, very influential sort of social commentator. But later in his career, he became adamant that cancer could be cured with a lot of vitamin C. And this became like his big talking point, that just enough vitamin C could cure most of our ills, including cancer. Well, he had enough clout that you've got medical researchers running experiments to try to validate his claims, and they turned up nothing. They said, nope, that's not true. His response was to attack the medical profession and attack the researchers, saying that they were guilty of sloppy research and that he was right. So this guy, a classic epistemic trespasser, he clearly had expertise in certain areas and had a lot of clout, but he moved into another topic. And he not only did damage by moving into the topic, he arguably did damage by undercutting the public's confidence in the work of other experts who were saying you're wrong. And he was using his platform to say, no, you're wrong. You're guilty of misconduct here. So that's one example. Another example Valentine gives, I should say, given the comments, the next two examples Valentine gives in the paper are actually Neil deGrasse Tyson and Richard Dawkins. They're both in a similar sort of lane. So I just picked out Dawkins here. Both are excellent scientists. Both are also excellent popularizers of science. They're entertaining writers and they're good thinkers, but they have this tendency to start talking about things that they don't know much about, but doing so with a high amount of confidence So, and I think particularly in the case of Dawkins, he's so often dismissive of those who he's talking about in other debates. He wants to get rid of religion. Recently, he was tweeting about, can you believe there's such a thing as continental philosophy? How ridiculous. What if we had continental science? And the response of people who understand how philosophy works is not a great analogy. But he feels very confident to make these pronouncements. He's an expert in one area, but doesn't stay in his lane. He comes into other areas and makes these confident pronouncements. Now, figuring out when exactly epistemic trespassing is bad can be tricky. So we don't want to block things like interdisciplinary research. Sometimes you have to move out of your comfort zone with the support of experts in other areas to engage in creative thinking or solve problems. So I don't want to say that's the problem. One way to think about this judgment making is you're trusting your own judgment rather than the relevant expert's judgment, even though you've moved into their turf. So if, for example, I judge that human-induced climate change is real, but I say, well, the reason I believe that is because I trust the experts. That's not epistemic trespassing. That's me just accepting a belief because I've trusted the judgment of the experts. Epistemic trespassing is when you say, move aside, expert, I can do this task better myself. Or I'm more fit to speak about this area than you are. That's epistemic trespassing. Or at least that's how I'm construing it. Because epistemic trespassing is such like a new topic in the literature, I think in the years to come, people will be hashing out what exactly the boundaries are. But I hope this gives you like a general sense. So Ballantyne suggests that normally epistemic trespassers should do one of two things. Either they should gain cross-field expertise, or they should stop trespassing. So if I really want to make pronouncements about sociology, or if I'm really confident that I've got this sociology thing figured out, as a non-sociologist, what I could do is I could go back to grad school. I could try to become a sociologist. I could try to gain that expertise, or I could find a mentor who's a sociologist, who's willing to let me help her run experiments or help her do her research. And I can learn some more about sociology. So the idea is I could gain some of the expertise. And once I've done that, then I'm in a bit of a better position to comment. But Ballantyne's idea is unless I'm willing to make that investment, go through the experience of being trained by the experts, if I'm not willing to do that, then I should stop trespassing. I should stop saying that vitamin C will cure cancer. So that's Ballantyne's take on what you should do. But as I said earlier, there were two philosophers who right around the same time started talking about epistemic trespassing. One was Ballantyne, the other is Mikhail Gherkin. So Gherkin suggests that in a lot of contexts, you can get by with something else. He offers the following guideline. He says when S, and S could refer to any subject, any person, when S provides expert trespassing testimony in a context where it may likely and or reasonably be taken to be expert testimony, S should qualify her testimony to indicate that it does not amount to expert testimony. So what exactly does that guideline amount to? I think it's best to see what Gherkin's talking about via example. So this is one of the examples that he gives. I'm quoting the example here from his text. So Shoshana, a meteorologist working in atmospheric composition research, is being interviewed for a local news broadcast on the topic of anthropogenic global warming. During the interview, she is asked about the impact of global warming on aquatic life. Shoshana recalls from an airline magazine citing a marine biologist stating that warmer waters cause coral bleaching. On this basis, Shoshana herself reckons that since coral reefs form the base of the food chain and the aquatic habitat, there will be no fish to eat in 50 years. So she answers that there will be no fish to eat in 50 years. So we got to figure out a few things about what's going on with this example. First, Gherkin thinks this is a case of epistemic trespassing. So we've got Shoshana. She's a meteorologist. She's got an area of expertise. But the prospects of aquatic life based on change in temperature, that's outside of her area expertise. So she's a scientist. She's got some expertise, but she's asked during an interview to comment on a matter that falls outside of her expertise. If we're thinking from Ballantyne's perspective, she's got two options. One is gain the cross-field expertise. Well, she can't do that during the course of an interview, so that's not really an option. So if we're following Ballantyne, the only option would be to not comment. So something Shoshana could have done is say, well, that really gets outside of my area of expertise. If you want to know about the impact of global warming on aquatic life, talk to someone in such and such a field. That's sort of like the Ballantyne advice. But that's not what Shoshana does. She thinks about the information she has and derives a conclusion. But she's not doing that in any sort of special way that relies on her expertise. She's thinking, well, here's something I read. Here's some background information I have. Here's something that I think will happen. So Gherkin's suggestion is in a case like this, she doesn't have to say nothing, but she sort of has to make it clear to her audience that we veered out of her territory of expertise. So she could say something like, well, I'm not an expert when it comes to marine biology. However, I have read that there's been a lot of coral bleaching due to climate change. And based on what I know, this would make me worried about the future of aquatic life and whether or not there's still going to be fish in the future. She might say something like that, where she's not continuing to pronounce as an expert, but she's not shutting down either. So that's Gherkin's suggestion for what someone could do in a context like this. I have sort of mixed feelings about this case. That doesn't seem obviously wrong to me. It doesn't seem obviously right either. So I'd welcome people's thoughts during the Q&A if anyone wants to talk about it, about whether or not you think Gherkin's guideline that you need to qualify your testimony is sufficient in a case like this. But the reason why I don't feel like I need to have a strong answer about whether or not that's a good practice in a case like this is because I want to talk about another case where I think it's clearly not a sufficient practice. So here's sort of the thesis for the back half of this talk. Depending on how one interprets Gherkin's principle, either it fails to give relevant guidance or it gives the wrong guidance, and there should be more to this claim here, in the context of expert witnesses in trial. I'm going to advocate that expert witnesses in legal trials should not make any claims outside their area of expertise if the claim is of the type that normally it could only be offered by a properly qualified expert witness. I call this the no courtroom trespassing principle. So the basic idea is if it's the sort of thing only an expert can say in court as a witness, don't say it unless you're that expert. So it's moving back to the sort of Ballantyne model where you've got two options, basically. Be an expert in the area or don't say anything. Gherkin's principle won't do. So I have this thing where I say, depending on how one interprets Gherkin's principle, either it fails to give relevant guidance or it gives the wrong guidance. Why do I say that? Well, it's because I think there's a certain sort of ambiguity here. Let's look at the principle again. When S provides expert trespassing testimony in a context where it may likely and reasonably be taken to be expert testimony, S should qualify her testimony to indicate that it does not amount to expert testimony. Here's two ways to think about it. One is you really shouldn't ever engage in epistemic trespassing. But hey, if you're gonna do it, at the very least, qualify that that's what you're doing. Don't continue to pretend to be an expert. That's one way to think about this principle. And if that's what Gherkin's up to, then I don't think it's wrong. I just think it's sort of irrelevant to the case of expert witness testimony. Because I don't think there should ever be a time when you say, well, if you're gonna do it, like that should be the end of it. There shouldn't be a time when you're gonna do it. We might feel like things are a bit more lenient during a TV interview than during a courtroom trial. maybe not. And one of the things I want to come back to is actually this question of whether or not Gherkin's principle even works in the TV interview case. But if we understand it the one way, well, if you're going to do it, then I think it's just not particularly relevant. Another way to interpret the principle is to say, okay, I hear you're interested in doing some epistemic trespassing. Well, if you want to do that in the right sort of way, qualify, please. Make it clear that you're not an expert. And if that's how we're understanding the principle, then I think the principle is just wrong when applied in the context of expert witness testimony. Although it might be perfectly fine in some other cases, to the extent that he's concerned about science communication and being put on the spot when you're doing an interview, it may be a perfectly reasonable way to go about things. Okay, so my thesis is, at least when it comes to expert witnesses in court, you shouldn't epistemically trespass at all. Okay. So I've just said you should not make any claims outside your area of expertise. Well, what kind of should am I talking about? Given that earlier I distinguished between legal reasons, epistemic reasons, and moral reasons. I actually think this principle is true, whether or not you think of the should as a legal should, an epistemic should, or a moral one. You should not do it for any of those reasons. But I'm going to focus on the epistemic reading, and then I'm going to connect that epistemic reading to the moral reading. That's my goal. So I'm going to back up just for a second and give a little bit of context about how trials work. I have the US court system in mind here when I'm talking about this, but what I say is going to be true of lots of different jurisdictions. So in court, there are two types of witnesses. You can have lay witnesses or expert witnesses. Lay witnesses testify about relevant knowledge acquired by personal perception. So for example, if you witnessed someone running from a crime scene, you might be asked to testify in court, well, what did you see? What did the person look like? How fast were they running? Stuff like that. You're doing that not because you're a special expert at identifying runners. You're doing it because you're the person that happened to be there and saw something. Whereas an expert witness testifies about relevant matters by virtue of their expertise acquired through knowledge, skill, experience, training, or education. And this particular formulation comes right from the federal rules of evidence. So, if you have a doctor come in as an expert witness in a trial, or a biologist, or an engineer, what have you, and these people are providing information to the finders of fact, either a judge or a jury, they're there because they're experts. And somehow having the information that they have as experts is relevant to the legal question. So for example, if a product malfunctions and someone gets hurt, you might bring in the relevant sort of designer, architect, engineer, et cetera, to talk about how that product is supposed to work, what the procedures are, what the technology is like, the science undergirding that tech, something like that. When people are doing that sort of thing, they're an expert witness. So in this presentation, when I'm thinking about expert witness epistemic trespassing, I'm thinking about this latter category of speaker. So I think often the best way to make points vivid is through stories. So here's a story of a trial where epistemic trespassing had happened, and the results were pretty tragic. So in 1989, an HIV positive prisoner in Texas, Curtis Weeks, was convicted of attempted murder because he spit on a prison guard's face. Here's two relevant facts that should make this outcome seem troubling. Here's the first one. HIV cannot be transmitted by spitting. Saliva doesn't transmit the virus. It deactivates it and breaks it down. So that's the first fact. Second, in Texas, attempted murder requires committing an act that could have caused the death of the complainant, but failed to do so. So if we're construing this rule reasonably, Curtis Weeks could not possibly have been guilty of attempted murder because the action of spitting on the officer could not have caused the death of the complainant, but failed to do so. Now, I know we're philosophers, so you might think, well, could, sure, just about anything could cause the death of the complainant, but failed to do so. So we have to sort of like turn off that analytic bit of the philosopher brain, because otherwise, well, just about anything could be used as grounds for attempted murder. And if you run sort of like a reductio, well, it can't be the case that, me walking out to my car, me getting the mail, me waving hello, if these sort of things don't make me guilty of attempted murder, even though in some sense, maybe they could have caused the death of the complainant, but failed to do so. So too, spitting on someone else as an HIV positive person cannot cause the death of a complainant, but failed to do so. So in this trial, so we've got a criminal trial for attempted murder in Texas, late 80s. And there's 4 expert witnesses, which first of all, I found sort of surprising that there was 4 witnesses in just like in this case at all. But there were 4 witnesses, 3 for the prosecution and 1 for the defense. So the first 3 witnesses here were for the prosecution. So the first, Mark Dowell, he's an MD. At the time, he was a doctor of infectious diseases at Baylor College of Medicine. He now practices, I think, in New Mexico or Arizona, somewhere in the South Midwest. So he was one of the witnesses for the prosecution. His position was, so sorry, we have to step back in time. So it's the late 80s here. We've known about HIV for less than a decade at this point. Like today in 2020, like, yes, clear, absolutely no question, people don't get HIV from being spit on. But we have to ask the question, what was the state of knowledge in the late 80s? So here was the rough state of knowledge. There hadn't been credible cases of someone getting HIV by being spit on. So that's an initial sort of like piece of evidence by absence. So researchers were looking into, why is it the case that we're not getting credible cases of someone seroconverting, someone becoming HIV positive because they were spit on? And they were finding evidence that saliva basically deactivated HIV. So normally HIV isn't present in saliva. Sometimes it can be, but it's not infectious when it's in saliva. But this was sort of like an emerging set of findings that had only been realized in recent years. And consensus continued to build during the 1990s. So if you look, there were several like major newspapers that in the early 90s like ran headlines about the fact that there was like new confirmation that HIV can't be transmitted by spitting. But so the position was maybe a bit precarious. If you were an expert who was up to date on the latest research, you should feel pretty comfortable saying, yeah, saliva doesn't transmit HIV. But this wasn't a particularly well-established fact beyond that domain. So you've got Dowell. Dowell was functioning as a practicing physician. He wasn't conducting medical research. So his position was, we don't know of any cases where HIV has been transmitted via saliva, but I don't want to say that the probability is 0. Like we have found some cases where saliva does have HIV in it in a small percentage of people. So he wanted to say, I can't say the probability or the possibility is 0. That was his position. Second witness, also for the prosecution, Paul Cameron. So Cameron has a PhD in psychology and has never been affiliated with any academic institution for doing work on HIV. He was kicked out of the American Psychological Association in the 1980s, and he formed his own nonprofit, of which he was the president and CEO, the Family Research Institute. The Family Research Institute is it's an organization with an agenda. So this guy, part of his goal was sort of like preserving the traditional family, which for him meant fighting against same-sex marriage. I mean, it wasn't even same-sex marriage wasn't the question in 1989, but his position was homosexuality was a sin, and this ought not be adopted as like an acceptable family lifestyle. And that is still his position today, 32 years later, still as the president and chairman of the Family Research Institute. The difference is now he's been sort of publicly sanctioned by judges in subsequent trials where he tried to testify as an expert witness. So this guy, all four of these people were qualified as experts about HIV, which first of all is a very broad category. What does it mean to be an expert about HIV? But this guy was qualified as an expert on HIV. And in the appeals court, because this case was appealed, the court said that he was admitted as an expert because of self-testimony that he spent a goodly amount of time on literature review. So basically, this guy was reading articles about HIV, and that was the basis for him being entered into this trial as an expert witness about HIV. His testimony conflicted with Dowell's. He claimed that there were a dozen or so verified cases of HIV being transmitted via things like kissing, spitting, etc., via saliva. That was his claim. And here he is before the jury as an expert, just like the first guy. So the third person, Lorraine Day, also a medical doctor. At the time, she was the chair of orthopedic surgery at the University of California at San Francisco. And she was worried about the possibility of contracting HIV while performing surgery. So she too started doing independent research on HIV, but she has no training in infectious diseases or microbiology. Her own, so she's also here as an expert in HIV. And she says much the same thing that Cameron says. Yes, there have been documented incidences where HIV was transmitted via saliva. Day later left the University of California at San Francisco. And oddly enough, this is just a weird coincidence, became a disciple of the vitamin C can cure cancer camp. And she spent a lot of her later years advocating for this, as well as Holocaust denial. So not a great subsequent track record. So here's the state of affairs. You've got three witnesses for the prosecution. One says, no documented cases, but I can't say zero. Two other that say, oh yeah, there are documented cases of saliva transmitting HIV. The fourth guy, the only expert for the defense, was also the only one of the four expert witnesses to actively be doing research on the transmission of HIV. He sat on the committee that gave recommendations for approval to the FDA for HIV treatment drugs. This was his bread and butter. This was his line of work. And his position was no one has ever gotten HIV by being spit on. And in fact, even though occasionally HIV ends up in saliva, it's deactivated. So you're the jury. You've just heard from four experts. Two say there are documented cases. One say no documented cases, but can't say zero chance. And the fourth one's saying basically zero chance. What do you do? So part of why I pick this case is because you can sort of see epistemic trespassing happening at various degrees. You can be guilty of slight epistemic trespassing or severe epistemic trespassing. So you might think Cameron here has the most severe case of epistemic trespassing. He's got no training in medicine or life sciences. He's got the same sort of expertise that most people in this room have, namely knowing how to read articles and find them. That was really all he's bringing to the table. So this, I would say, is a case of severe epistemic trespassing. Day's case is not quite as severe. She was and is a medical doctor, but she also had no experience treating HIV positive patients or doing research on HIV/AIDS. She was an orthopedic surgeon. And these two were the ones that gave the testimony that was least in accordance with what experts thought at the time. Now you have Dowell, who maybe wasn't guilty of epistemic trespassing at all, or if he was, it was slight. So he is a doctor of infectious diseases, which clearly is relevant. He's much more of an expert than I am, but he had a shortcoming. Namely, he wasn't abreast of the recent research and the way that Richard Pollard was. So maybe no trespassing, at most subtle. But then you kind of have Pollard, who's the example of the sort of expert witness you want. Like his day-to-day work is doing research on the topic at hand. And he was able to sort of explain away the reason why Dowell wasn't comfortable saying that there was zero chance. So the result was Curtis Weeks was convicted of attempted murder. And then he lost 3 appeals because in each case, the appeals court deferred to the jury's decision. He ended up dying in the early 2000s in prison still from complications related to AIDS. So the consequences of epistemic trespassing can be severe. They can be significant. I want to say what Day and Cameron, oh, by the way, this is Cameron and Day. That's why we've got these faces on the side of the slide. What Cameron and Day, and perhaps to an extent Dowell, did in that case was not only epistemically wrong, but it was morally wrong. So I want to sort of examine what was the nature of that wrong? Why was this wrong? So one reason is that epistemic trespassing by expert witnesses creates misleading higher order evidence about the views of relevant experts. So if you're the jury, you might think, well, who am I to question the judge's judgment as to who the experts are? And who am I to question what these experts say? If you were just tallying the numbers, more experts seem to think it was possible than not. So these jurors have been given misleading information. Here's the second reason why it seems both morally and epistemically problematic. The stakes of trials are high, and our epistemic standard should be high to match those stakes. So within epistemology, there's a set of views labeled pragmatic encroachment, where it basically, to sum up the view, what counts as knowing is affected by what's at stake. You might think similarly, the epistemic standards we employ or how much evidence we need ought to be connected to what's at stake. What was at stake here was whether or not a man spent the rest of his life in prison. Those are pretty high stakes. And as a result, you might think we need to be extra epistemically careful. And to the extent that some of the witnesses weren't that careful, they will have committed an epistemic wrong that was also a moral wrong. Finally, trials have an opt-in system for the evidence presented. By that, I mean, not just anybody gets to come testify. Not just any piece of evidence gets admitted. There's supposed to be a rigorous process of who gets in to say what. So if you're approved as an expert, there's a way in which that's unfair if you're not actually an expert. How come Paul Cameron and Lorraine Day, who came to the trial with an agenda, get to talk to the jury, but other people with agendas don't? There's an unfairness here that can be made fair if you're an expert who has things to tell the jury. But that wasn't true in this case. So there's a certain sort of unfairness here on both the epistemic and the moral level. So for the sake of time here, I'm going to try to wrap up in the next couple of minutes. But I want to entertain one other way of sort of conceptualizing what went wrong in the Weeks case. One way to think about it is the expert witnesses created a bad epistemic position. And this goes back to this sort of misleading evidence bit. What do I mean by a bad epistemic position? I mean a position where it's difficult to figure out the truth. If Pollard had been the only witness, if the most qualified expert had been the only witness, things might have been a lot easier for the jury to figure out. But the introduction of these additional expert witnesses made things more complicated. It made the truth more difficult to discern. So a number of epistemologists and historians of science have examined how powerful actors have created bad epistemic positions for others concerning all sorts of important public policy issues. There was a number of books I could have put here as the example on the side, but the one I've picked is Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway's book, Merchants of Doubt, where they look at how there have been a variety of different misinformation or disinformation campaigns in recent decades in American political history, from things like trying to create a false sense of disagreement amongst experts as to whether or not smoking is harmful, to today trying to create the same sort of environment where you think there isn't much consensus amongst climate scientists about climate change, when in actuality, there's a lot more consensus than these sort of peddlers of misinformation might lead you to think. At root, epistemic trespassing and these other forms of misinformation creation share a bad-making feature, which is namely that they create epistemically bad positions for others. They create positions where it's hard for other people to figure out what the truth is. And I think that's a morally bad thing to do, particularly when the stakes are high around something like smoking, or how you rule in a trial, or something like climate change or COVID-19. So earlier I'd said there are questions about whether or not my critique of Gherkin's principle in the context of expert witnesses generalizes more broadly. Just for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into that, but it's something I'd be happy to talk about. So thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Satta. That was great. We've got plenty of time for questions. So if you've got questions for Mark, please either send them in the chat or go ahead and unmute. We'll keep it pretty informal if that's okay with you, Dr. Satta.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah.
And I know Bruce Jans, Dr. Jans had a comment in the chat, which I think if I can summarize, goes something like, Gherkin's qualification seems to open the door to like a general denial of expertise. I wondered if you might, if Bruce, you want to clarify, or if Mark, you want to jump in.
Yeah, Bruce, if you'd be willing to say a bit more, I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts here.
Sure. Well, what I had in mind was the situation we see on a regular basis in Congress, where some politician stands up and says, "Well, I'm not a scientist, but,"
Yes.
and then goes and invades upon something or other. And it seems to me rhetorically, what is going on there is not just a kind of distancing based on, well, I don't want to claim expertise that I don't have, but really a muddying of any epistemic possibilities whatsoever. In other words, I'm not a scientist, and neither is anyone else. It's all opinion, it's all politics. And so if that's the game we're playing, then I should be able to say whatever I want.
Right. No, yeah, this is great. Right, there is that I'm not a scientist, but trope. There's even a guy who's written a book called like Not a Scientist, which was actually just an okay book. But like it sort of played on this this trope. Right. So you bring up some interesting points about what a politician is doing when they say, I'm not a scientist, but they continue to very confidently state something. So I think there's a few different relevant issues going on here. First, there's the question of, well, why bother qualifying at all if you're still going to speak as if you're an authority from on high? I think one way to think about it is they're using it for self-protection. If I want to say, hey, you confidently made these claims, you're in no position to do that. They can say, well, I started by saying I'm not a scientist. Does that mean I can't have opinions anymore? Come on. So I think it's sort of like a smart rhetorical move for the politician to sort of like give themselves a way out by saying I'm not a scientist, but. So that's one thing that's going on. But you're right, there's another important epistemic issue, which is sort of like a leveling problem. The idea that, well, no one's really an expert. All we've got are opinions. And I think this is so relevant to a lot of this sort of political epistemic mush that we're experiencing right now. There is this sort of like leveling down feature. So that something that comes to mind, the historian Tim Snyder, he wrote a book a couple of years ago called The Road to Unfreedom. And he's got this passage, I'm just loosely paraphrasing, where the idea is you can sort of be a selective critic you can find the peccadillos in a particular. No one's perfect. Scientists are going to make mistakes in terms of how they explain things. Even the most careful journalist is sometimes going to make mistakes in how they explain things. So sometimes there's this sort of move where you say, look at how often the scientists mess up or the journalists mess up. You can't trust them. Well, then you might think, well, if that's our standard, can we trust anybody any of the time? So sorry, getting back to Snyder, his move is sort of, the move he identifies is a failure to recognize how frequently someone messes up or how frequently they speak beyond their expertise. You end up with this sort of leveling of the playing field where no one's really an expert. Everyone's got an angle. No one can really be trusted. But then, of course, it's never the response of that person that they become a skeptic and trust nobody. It seems like they sort of employ it selectively. Sometimes they use the attitude of, I don't trust anybody, to dismiss things they don't want to hear. But they also ironically use it as a way to sort of like ground confidence in their own opinions. The idea is, well, if you can be confident in your view, I can be confident in mine too. And we're just going to have to live with that. So yeah, I think there's this sort of this set of heuristic thinking mechanisms that a politician taps into with a move like, but I'm not a scientist, that sort of like removes accountability and levels the playing field. So then your last worry is, well, is Gherkin's principle leading us to that? I think maybe, but I'm not sure, because, if the scientist, in contrast, if the meteorologist is good about saying, well, this actually is an area where I'm an expert. I've conducted field research. Here are my reasons why I can talk about this, but I'm going to be cautious and not talk about that. You could see it could actually help us employ norms of epistemic humility, because epistemic humility doesn't mean never being confident about anything. If you've got great reasons, then be confident. Just don't overplay your hand. So that's sort of like my hopeful view for what a Gherkin style principle could do for us.
Great, thanks.
Sure.
Dr. Satta, Jordan Shamblin in the chat mentions worries that this sort of epistemic trespassing risk is exacerbated in digital spaces through online protocols. So we might talk about that a little bit. And then Dr. Maurer from the English Department of Text and Technology here on campus gives the example of Milton Friedman in the Chicago School of Economics and whether or not there are times when the lay expert should trespass in order to course correct or put pressure.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll try to do this in order. So first of all, I think it is the case that sort of like the proliferation of digital media makes epistemic trespassing issues worse. There's a way in which, so in the case of a courtroom trial, there's a person whose job it is to be the gatekeeper, the judge. Sometimes judges mess up, like in the Weeks case. But in theory, you've got someone who's got some training in being a judge and has sort of like the time and leisure, ideally, to make thought out, informed decisions about who gets before the jury in the first place. So there's a literal gatekeeper. Like the case law talks about judges having a responsibility to gatekeep who gets to speak as a witness. So that sort of mechanism does not exist on the internet. And I think an issue we've seen a lot in the last year is sort of subtle forms of epistemic trespassing. Sometimes the person who goes viral is someone completely random. Sometimes it's an outlier in a profession. So I guess actually I want to stop and make a distinction between two different sorts of related harms. There's the harm of epistemic trespassing, where you speak in an area where you're not an expert. There's also the harm of being dishonest, being a charlatan, refusing to accept the facts from within your own field. So in Merchants of Doubt, I think Oreskes and Conway are more concerned probably with this latter sort of person. if you get someone who's willing to sell out, they can create a false impression of confusion where actually there's a lot of consensus. So, you can in essence become a doubt sower for hire. There's in fact another book, I forget who the author is, but the title is Doubt is Our Product. And that title came from a memo from an executive at a tobacco company who said in their misinformation campaign that doubt is our product. The idea is that's what you're trying to sell. You maybe can't convince everybody that smoking is great for your health, but at the very least, you can get them into the sort of position that Bruce was talking about where, well, no one really knows. Who's to say whether or not smoking is harmful for us? That sounds very tricky. I've got my opinion, you've got yours. I guess we've just got to live with it. Eventually, the tobacco companies lost that battle in the public mind. But part of Oreskes and Conway's point was that the general framework for creating a battle has been transferred. This idea that you sow doubt. And one way to sow doubt is to get some loud outliers. Those loud outliers can be epistemic trespassers who don't actually belong in the field, but are willing to say that they belong in the field. Other times you get someone who sort of like breaks rank and is willing to muck up the view that there's consensus. But this so nicely connects with the excellent second question about Milton Friedman. Sort of everything I've been saying has been operating under the assumption that the relevant fields of expertise are doing a good job at what they're doing, or at least a comparatively good job. They're doing better than I would, or your average person would, at telling us truths about, political science, physics, dental hygiene, whatever. But of course, that's not always going to be the case. There are downsides to closed systems of expertise, particularly when the training model is the new generation learns from the old generation that has a particular set of mental conceptions about the way things should work, or how we filter our data, or what paradigms we're using to structure the inquiry. And so it's a two-edged sword. Expertise gives us a lot of good stuff, but political structures of expertise that are misguided can harm. And sometimes you can disrupt those harmful structures from within by becoming an expert and then challenging your own field. Sometimes maybe the best critiques come from without. This particularly is true when we're addressing what Ballantyne calls cross-disciplinary questions. So sometimes you can have a question about, well, who are the relevant experts when it comes to X? And maybe the dividing lines can get carved in the wrong sort of way. Economics stakes a claim on a certain sort of question, where actually a social scientist or a philosopher or whoever might have a really excellent corrective to offer that is rooted in their expertise. So yeah, I guess there's that sort of like, there's an irreducible element of needing good judgment or needing wisdom. I can't just tell you the procedural rules that will always lead to the right outcomes. I can't give you a procedural rule of sort of like when to defer to an established power structure that occupies an area of expertise. It is very contextual. So I think a lot of my conversation, or a lot of what I've said, operates under the assumption that no, the research scientists who are studying HIV really are in a better position than the psychologist who was kicked out of the APA to know how HIV is transmitted. But that's not true in all times and in all places of an entity or group that's put forward as the experts. We can make social epistemic mistakes about who the experts are, or the scope of their expertise.
There's a couple more. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say I'd seen there are more questions in the chat that I haven't read yet. So
yeah, so there's one from Annabelle, and again, Annabelle, I'll paraphrase, but if you want to jump in and correct me, feel free. But Annabelle's question was about when can you call yourself an expert? So
yeah,
for example, right, she's a friend of hers wanted her, who's taken some immunology classes, to talk about vaccine efficacy. Um, Under what conditions is that acceptable? Where's the boundary between lay and expert?
yeah, it's another great question. My own view is that expertise is something that comes in degrees. It's not like, for example, the moment someone walks across the stage and gets that master's degree, gets that PhD, gets their first job in the field, that's when you're suddenly an expert. Just as epistemic trespassing can happen in degrees, so too can gaining expertise happen in degrees. So that's like a starter answer, but I can be a bit more specific. So here are two things to think about. One, the philosopher Elizabeth Anderson has a paper. The title's long. It's something about like public policy, democracy, epistemic. It's a long title, so I can't tell you what it is. But in this 2011 paper, she sort of outlines basically how expertise comes in degrees. She's thinking specifically about scientists. So there's a way in which her rules don't generalize completely. But sort of like her first tier is like getting undergraduate level training in a particular science. That's sort of like level A. Level B would then be, and then you practice in the relevant area. This is a paraphrase. I'm not sure it's perfectly right. But then, you can get a graduate degree. You can be a graduate degree and then have your graduate degree and then be an epistemic, be a practicing researcher in a particular area. So she says there's sort of like degrees of expertise that build over time. So sometimes, I think often in conversations with our loved ones or people in our lives, it's a matter of sort of like framing the degree of expertise one has. So I think there's a way in which it's sort of like a personal question when someone feels comfortable taking on the label of expert. How far into your training do you want to wait? But you can start talking earlier about like having gained some expertise in the relevant area. You could say, well, I've taken coursework where the focus was this. I learned from an expert about this. As a result, I feel more confident in my ability to talk about, vaccines or something like that because of the relevant training that I've gotten. So I think it's useful to sort of like frame it in terms of degrees of expertise. And sometimes it's a product of who's in the room with you and who else could contribute. So, if you were talking to someone about vaccines and Dr. Fauci shows up, you might be like, oh, actually, let's have him talk about it. He's the real expert here. But if you're, dealing with a philosopher lawyer like me who doesn't know much about science, I'd love to learn from you. I'd love to gain from your expertise about what you know about vaccines that I don't. So I think that's kind of the best I've got to say there.
And Mark, your answer should feel really comfortable to a lot of us who've been around the center in the Be Better Club, because we talk a lot about ethics as a form of literacy, the idea that we're developing expertise in our areas over time through experience and habituation and all those things. So it's this idea that, like you said, it's not like we step off a stage with a degree in hand or even, get to Dr. Fauci's level and all of a sudden we're an expert. It's this like becoming process over time.
Yeah.
Joseph asked a really interesting question. I think it's next in the queue here about the potential relationship between collective epistemic trespassing and individual trespassing. Joseph, if you want to unpack that a little bit, you should feel free, but otherwise you can riff off of that, Mark.
First off, thank you for being here, Dr. Satta.
My pleasure.
So I guess my question, I'm really interested mostly in the second part where we talk about epistemic and moral harm, but really I'm wondering if there's a difference in the way trespassing operates as committed by an individual, perhaps in the context of a courtroom giving testimony, and in cases such as the such as a lobbying firm or even peer pressure on a playground, really, where there's an individual claiming to know more than perhaps their expertise relevantly allows them, and where a collective or a group of people commit this act?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So, right, Ballantyne frames all his examples using individuals. And then what do? I come along and I give an example of an individual as well. But there's nothing about this phenomenon that says it has to be an individual actor who's trespassing. If we think about like the property metaphor, just as like an individual can trespass, so can a group also so trespass. So I think this might also connect back with sort of like political considerations. So here's a different worry you can have. There are a number of states that criminalize different activities of HIV positive people, things like biting and spitting, where the criminal law is not doing anything to curb the spread of HIV. What it's doing is just making the lives of HIV people extra scary and challenging. And you might think that there's some sort of like collective failure going on by the part of legislatures, a state legislature that keeps a law like this on the books. So I guess we could think through sort of like the different solutions that have been proposed. You know, Ballantyne says, well, either gain the cross-field expertise or stop trespassing. I think another option that he misses, but that you could say is develop, so if the solutions are stop epistemic trespassing, gain the cross-field expertise, another thing is become well informed by the experts and share some information, but make it clear you're getting it from the experts. So I think this becomes particularly relevant when we start thinking about groups that epistemically trespass. So in the case of a legislature, maybe their obligation is to go talk to the experts and become better informed. And once they're better informed, they can make decisions about which laws to keep on the books or not. Of course, part of the problem with legislatures is sometimes they keep laws on the books, not because they think they reflect the way the world really is, but because they think it'll make their voters happy. So in a way, like a legislature is an imperfect example. But you can think about, there are certainly groups of people, different sorts of structures and organizations that are designed in essence to help cultivate epistemic trespassing. So you can think about, for example, if you took a think tank and their goal was to promote a particular agenda. It wasn't find the facts first and then figure out our agenda from there. It's start with the agenda and then, you know, find someone who's willing to say the facts that we want them to say to promote our agenda. This goes back to these disinformation campaigns, something like with smoking or global warming. You might think that's a case of group epistemic trespassing, where people are in fact coordinated actors that help one another epistemically trespass. And gee, I mean, I don't know. I guess my thought about what someone should do, my first gut instinct as well is just stop being that kind of organization, to like just disband. Or at the very least, like change the order of your priorities. Start from the evidence and the facts and come up with your the agendas that you want to promote from there. I don't know if that gets at what you were going for. If there's something else, a follow-up you're hoping for, feel free to say more.
To follow up, let me see if I can formulate this briefly. I guess, would we say that in these cases of groups operating to trespass with some level of organization or coordination, would we attribute the act of testimony or possession of the information contained within the testimony, would we attribute that to the collective or to the individuals which comprise the collective?
Yeah. Okay. This is a really good sort of like metaphysical question about like the nature of what epistemic trespassing is. So Nathan Ballantyne describes epistemic trespassing in terms of judgment. There are people who will make judgments in one area where they're not an expert. Mikkel Gherkin tends to focus more on the act of testimony. So it's the person who makes an utterance or claims something. So there's a question about like what kind of action gets at the heart of what trespassing is. And this gets particularly tricky when we start thinking about how to think about group trespassing. So you might think, you know, if I am the president of some sort of think tank and I fund you, I give you money, and then you go out and trespass in order to try to create confusion about a particular issue. We might think you're the trespasser and I'm just the enabler, particularly if we think about the heart of epistemic trespassing as testimony. But if it's sort of like a judgment and sort of like the stance of our organization is that we've judged a particular way, then you might think this gets into questions about like group action, which is like beyond my pay grade, out of my league. I'm not an expert about group action. There we go. So, and I guess I'm taking Gherkin's advice here. I'm going to say, well, after qualifying that I'm not an expert about group action, I'm just not going to testify because I'm not sure how group action works. But I think your answer is going to hinge on your sort of like theory of group action. That's a great set of questions.
Dr. Jones asked a question about trespassing in ethics or morality more generally. So are some people more expert than others in ethics or morality? Yeah,
so this is a kind of hotly contested question in moral epistemology. So it's a really good question. Can you be an expert in ethics or in ethics of a certain type? And philosophers disagree. So I guess I'll just offer a few sort of like considerations for why you might think at least. So I'll start with this. There's a question about how narrowly we carve domains. So there's, you know, I can be an expert in philosophy, or I could be an expert in epistemology. I could be an expert in social epistemology. So I think when it comes to something like ethics, I'm a little skeptical that someone can just be like, I don't know, an expert in ethics writ large. Like, but I do feel quite comfortable that people can develop expertise in like particular areas of ethics. So here's at least two different ways this could work. One, well, but they're related. They're both sort of like rooted in experience and training. So let's say you work on like the ethics board for a hospital or something like that. Presumably, you've gained expertise in a variety of different ways. If you were trained as an ethicist, for example, you've gained competency about theories, about ways of thinking through ethical puzzles and questions. And I think this is a legitimate form of expertise. Also, the more situations you encounter or hear about, there's a way you gain expertise. You might have thought your first day on the job that a particular policy solution would be excellent. Like it would be a good fix for an issue and that it would be ethically praiseworthy. But it may be because you didn't think about some of the consequences. Someone else on that board that's more experienced might say, well, if we do X, that could lead to Y. And that seems really ethically problematic. So there's a way in which you can build up expertise by understanding the context, the situation, the pitfalls, the need of the people involved, the ethical theory and principles underlying the domain. I think all of these things can give us expertise in ethics. So I think we can truly say that there are people who are experts in medical ethics or engineering ethics or business ethics. There's also certainly a way in which you can have expertise in ethics in general, in the sense of having expertise in like ethical theory. Another way you might think you get expertise is based on like life experiences. So you could think, you know, let's say you're at an event and a man says something sexist. There might be a way in which I am not as clued into what the most ethical response would be because of my own life experiences. I might be best to take my cues from the women in the room as to what the appropriate way to respond is. Either cues in the moment or just from conversation generally, learning from people about what is it you need given your situation in life and what are the relevant ethical concerns. So I think there are a variety of ways in which someone can gain expertise in ethics. Even if I'd be like short to say like I'm an expert in ethics, like writ large. It's a good question.
Dr. Kubler has a really good question about expertise as knowledge changes over time. And I might let him talk through that if he's willing.
Sure. So thanks very much. Yeah, I really enjoyed the talk. It gets me thinking about so many things, as I'm sure everyone else is. And I'm kind of curious about this idea that standards that we think about for judging expertise may not reflect an absolute truth, or the notion that there could be expertise within the time and the place. And I just think about how current knowledge has changed so much, especially in things like life science and health sciences, where we can see examples where fat was considered terrible for you and now fats are okay. And I understand the complexities of health science and why that would be true in epidemiological studies. But even within the physical sciences, there were heretics like Schechtman, who said quasi-crystals don't exist, and he was really scoffed at. And then later people realized, oh, he's right, and in fact these are useful materials. Let's give him a Nobel Prize. I mean, there are myriad examples of things that involve some sort of truth in time, and we would like to believe that all disciplines maybe converge towards some sort of absolute truth. In fact, we may be in a time and place where things are divergent. In any case, how does that inform how we try to frame notions of deciding who an expert is? Related to that, I'm very curious what you think about expertise within the context of individual versus crowd wisdom. It's intriguing to think that there's situations where individuals themselves cannot be experts. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Yeah, good questions. So I'll start with kind of the first part of your question. So heretofore, I've managed to sort of like skate through this presentation without giving an account of truth or an account of what makes someone expert. But ultimately, you can't avoid these questions forever, because sort of like how we address certain issues is going to depend on these things. So when it comes to being an expert, you might think you only count as an expert if you're reliably tracking the truth, or if like your skills are leading you to the truth or something like that. But depending on your philosophy of science, that might be no good, because you might think, well, we're always just sort of like approximating the truth, and the next time there's a paradigm shift, we're going to sort of realize like, oh, actually, yeah, like the way we were talking about that isn't quite right, or something like that. So I think I'm inclined to make my definition of expert sort of like socially comparative. Well, so here's two different ways you could have. Maybe the experts in a particular domain, in a particular historical period, were more reliable than anybody else at that historical period, but their rate of success was still pretty low. You could think that there are even, so Mikhail Gherkin, he wants to say that expertise doesn't require a high degree of reliability. And an example he gives is seismologists. Like if you say, hey, when's the next earthquake going to happen? Like they don't have that level of like reliability that can tell you like San Francisco, 10 minutes. Like, but it doesn't mean they're not experts. There's just sort of limits to what the discipline allows them to do. So one way you could understand expertise is sort of like comparative advantage. Even if the experts in a particular area, there's a whole ton of things they don't know, or things that they've got wrong. If they're better off at helping us heal our wounds, or keeping our teeth healthy, or getting a rocket into space or whatever. Like they're the experts, and it's comparative based on that historical period. Even if, 500 years from now, if someone had their level of knowledge and skill, they would no longer count as an expert. So that's one part of the answer. But I think there's a trickier issue that you've raised. Namely, so let's say it turns out that like folk wisdom on a topic is better at tracking the truth than the experts at a particular period of time. The experts could have gained some important knowledge, but this knowledge sort of like leads them down the wrong road, where they make, in fact, they reach conclusions that are worse than what your average layperson was just thinking all on their own. It's part of the process of eventually ending up in a better place, but I think there are periods, I think this is true in the history of medicine, where the patients might have been better off not seeing the doctor at all than going to see them. If you're going to get like bloodlet or something, I don't know. So what do we say about those people? Were those doctors experts? That's tricky. I don't think there's not a consensus answer, and I'm not sure I have a strong view on the matter, but like you're poking at the right spot to try to figure out what exactly the concepts are and how we should be thinking about things. So that's the first thing. But then you said something else, and I've forgotten what the other thing was.
I think you got to most of them. It was really a question of whether, when you're looking for expertise, whether you have to really inherently judge within the moment based on consensus. So I was kind of going there, or do we have to generate standards where we try to understand which presumed experts are maybe converging toward that absolute truth? So we might choose folk wisdom that says, no, my knee hurts when the weather's bad, as opposed to the meteorologist who says it has nothing to do with your knee. Well, it might actually.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good example. Yeah. So I think part of my answer is I'm sort of like pragmatic when it comes to like, I can make judgments about the record, who I think the experts are, but hold those judgments fallibly, realizing if I had the knowledge that people had 1,000 years from now, my assessments might be really different. But the best I can do is sort of like make the assessments I have. But yeah, then there are questions about, but then people can be entitled to reach different conclusions about who the experts are based on their evidence. So if you've got a bad knee that acts up, exactly 12 hours before it rains, and you've timed this, you've collected the data, you're like, yeah, this always happens. I trust my knee. There's a way in which you have evidence that I don't. So if an expert in some fields were to tell you, no, there's no way that your knee could be doing that, you're in a better position to say, well, I think the expert's wrong about that, because you've got very good evidence that your knee, in fact, does always predict 12 hours before it rains, something like that. So I think our assessments of expertise should be based on the evidence that we have. And since different individuals in society have different stocks of evidence, they can be reasonable in reaching different conclusions. I think this gets particularly thorny when we think about something like the different levels of trust that people of different races in the United States have towards the medical profession. Black Americans trust, a lot of studies have suggested that Black Americans trust the medical profession less. And arguably, I think it's reasonable to think they have different evidence. So the journalist and ethicist Harriet Washington she wrote a 2006 book called Medical Apartheid. And it sort of just catalogs a variety of different unethical and abusive medical experiments that have been conducted on Black people and other people of color in the United States. And one way to summarize her point is, sometimes we have this narrative that Black people don't trust doctors because of the Tuskegee syphilis study. But she wants to say, no, there's so much more evidence than that. And her view in that book is actually, look, things have gotten a lot better. It's going to be useful for Black people because of the improvements if they do sign up for medical tests, because that way they're represented in the samples in medical experiences. But she also wants to say, but your distrust is justified. She's a Black woman herself. She's saying, I get why you don't trust. And there are good reasons for this lack of trust. So then some of the questions become, what sort of responsibilities might the medical profession have to create trust in communities where there's higher levels of distrust, and that distrust is warranted.
Yeah, that was useful. Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Satta. We will stop there to save everybody's time. Let's give Dr. Satta a warm round of digital applause with the little handy thing in Zoom. I don't know, Mark, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
And to Dr. Strassa and the Department of Philosophy for co-sponsoring the event with us. And thanks everybody for being here. It's so nice to stay in touch this way. You can stay in touch with us through email or by the website, centerforethics.ucf.edu. In the meantime, do well, be better, and stay safe. And we'll see you next time. Thanks all.
Thank you all for your time and your great questions. I appreciate it.